Hi everyone, my name is Karan and I welcome you to the Indian Film Crew channel. आज की इस वीडियो में I'm going to tell you my 5 favorite photography and filmmaking podcast which I listen to, and I guess you should also listen to them because if you're into this profession, so that would be really helpful for you, and here they are. Alright, so the very first podcast has to be by the legendary Roger Deakins and his wife James Deakins, and the name of the podcast is Team Deakins. And man, I guess you know who Roger Deakins is, and if you don't, get a life. Just kidding. So he's one of the greatest cinematographers who is alive on this planet right now. Man, I don't know, मैं उससे ज़्यादा और क्या ही बोलूँ Roger Deakins के बारे में. तो इस podcast में he talks about his approach towards cinematography, and there he also invites other cinematographer guests जो कि also are like top notch industry cinematographers. तो वो आते हैं इस podcast में. It's a great platform if you want to learn something regarding cinematography. But I want to mention that this podcast is a little heavy. So if you're new into cinematography world, so I guess it won't be that helpful for you because they talk about like very deep stuff. So I don't think तुम्हारे लिए podcast बना है, but it's a gold mine and you should dig into it. Okay, so the second one has to be the Indy Mogul podcast. You might have heard about their YouTube channel, but उनका podcast भी है. The good thing about their podcast is that they talk about everything. They don't just talk about cinematography and stuff. They talk about production design. They talk about lighting. They talk about direction. They talk about everything related to film. So it's a great resource, but again, it's a little on the heavier side of things. So if you're not able to understand it, I would really highly suggest you to go and check out their YouTube channel because इनका YouTube channel भी बहुत ही मस्त है. They have like great content over there. So at least you should go and check out their YouTube channel. Otherwise, podcast is a great resource. And now the podcast which I'm going to talk about is one of my real favorites, and I don't think मैंने इसके एक भी episode छोड़ा है इस podcast का. It's such a beautiful podcast. The name of the podcast is the Golden Hour Podcast. इस podcast की खासियत क्या है कि there they invite guests who are Instagrammers, who are YouTubers, and to name some, there is Matty Hapoya, there is Lizzie Pierce, there is Chris Haw. इस तरह के creators and artists वहाँ पे आते हैं. तो it's a very easy to listen to podcast. So for people who are just starting to listen to podcasts, this is a great starting podcast, I guess, जिससे तुम्हें शुरू करना चाहिए. So you should definitely go and try it. Alright, so the next podcast which I really love and I would like to highly recommend is Black with No Cream. I know Black with No Cream sounds like a podcast जिसमें कॉफ़ी के बारे में बात होगी and stuff, but नहीं, ये सेम वही फिल्म मेकिंग फोटोग्राफी के बारे में बात होती है इसमें. इस पॉडकास्ट में डिफरेंट क्या है? इस पॉडकास्ट में डिफरेंट ये है कि दे इनवाइट गेस्ट हु आर आर्टिस्ट एंड फ्रीलांसर्स. तो दे आर नॉट लाइक रियली हाईली रिनाउंड पीपल, बट they are like great artists. So the things that you can learn from all those artists is something comparatively easier जो तुम उनसे चीज़ें सीख पाओगे. It's very easy to grasp and very easy to listen to podcast. The language used in this podcast is a little explicit, so I would like to give you a heads up on that. But I guess that adds to the rawness and authenticity of this podcast. So it's a really good podcast for people who are freelancers like you and me. So I guess it's a really highly recommended one. So you should go and check it out. Again, इन सब चीज़ों के link description में मिल जाएंगे, वहाँ जाके check कर लेना आराम से. Alright, so last but not the least, it's B&H Photography Podcast. Now this podcast, इसके बारे में एक खासियत बात ये है कि it talks a lot about photography and lighting and very less about filmmaking, but it's kind of unusual that you're learning photography के tricks using a podcast, and it helps, to be honest. मुझे लगा था कि photography आप just visually देख के ही सीख सकते हो, but इस podcast में they teach you things in such a very subtle and beautiful way कि I don't know how, it's very difficult to explain, but it's a beautiful resource. There I have found photographers जिनके बारे में मुझे कोई idea नहीं था कि वो exist भी करते हैं, and they are like, their work is like really good. तो I don't know why they are not popping out on Instagram इतना ज़्यादा कि मुझे नहीं पता था उनके बारे में. But this podcast is a hidden one. It's a golden source जो काफ़ी लोगों को नहीं पता है. And if you are someone who would like to learn photography के tricks and lighting के techniques, so if you are even a cinematographer and you want to learn on how you can light your subject in a very beautiful manner, B&H Photography Podcast is something which is a little hidden, so not a lot of people know about this podcast, and even if they know, it's not very well talked about. So you should go and check this podcast out. Alright, so those were my 5 favorite podcasts as of now, but you know, as a creator, as a person, I'm growing और मुझे नए podcast मिलते हैं. जैसे मुझे कोई नए podcast मिलेंगे, मैं इसी वीडियो के लिंक में डाल दूंगा, वो podcast चेक कर लेना. और मे भी हो सकता है फ्यूचर में एक नई वीडियो बना दूं जिसमें I talk about the newly explored podcast जिनके बारे में सुन रहा हूँ मैं. तो let me know in the comments if you'd like to know some other podcasts which I listen to, because ये सब podcasts होते हैं जिनमें मैं फिल्म मेकिंग फोटोग्राफी के बारे में बात करता हूँ, but there are a lot of other podcasts which I listen to. तो let me know in the comments कि तुम जानना चाहोगे कि और किस तरह के podcast मैं सुनता हूँ जो कि तुम्हारे लिए भी शायद हेल्पफुल हो थोड़े से. तो I will make a video on that too. और हाँ, जाने से पहले I want to give a shout out to our own podcast, Let's Beat Mediocrity. I want to say कि the next season of the podcast is coming next week. तो next week से हमारे podcast में वापस नए episodes आने वाले हैं, नए guests आने वाले हैं, and all those podcasts will be released on every Friday. That's the goal, but who knows कब release होता है. But next week नए episodes आ रहे हैं Let's Beat Mediocrity के. You should go and check it out. Link उसका तुम्हें description में मिल जाएगा, वहाँ जाके check कर लेना. कनेक्ट मी ऑन इंस्टाग्राम यहाँ पर एंड आई विल हैव टू से बाय बिकॉज ये सब था आज इस वीडियो के लिए एंड उसके अलावा कुछ भी नहीं है. आई विल सी यू नेक्स्ट वीक विद अनदर 2 वीडियोज़ क्योंकि हम पोस्ट करते हैं 2 वीडियोज़ एवरी सिंगल वीक इस चैनल पे. तब तक के लिए बाय, टेक केयर, सलाम एंड नमस्ते.